Hello, I'm Kay Jacobson with Ramsey County Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, which is part of the 2024 Great Decision Series. Our speaker today is Todd Lefko, and our topic is climate technology and competition. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relationship with our tribal nations. So, about our speaker. Todd Lefko is a president of the International Business Development Company, an import-export firm dealing with water purification equipment, kilns, linen, art, and new technologies. He has homes in both Minnesota and Moscow and has written more than 680 articles, which appeared weekly in Rossiyski Vesti, the political newspaper of the Russian presidential administration, as well as other Russian newspapers. Todd is on the editorial board for the Russian Historical Review, which is a quarterly journal, as well as being the English editor for 4 Russian books. Todd has worked in Russia for over 32 years. Todd has taught sociology and urban affairs at the University of Minnesota and political science, international relations, political philosophy, political campaign management, leadership, and organizational development at other Minnesota colleges. He's lectured at universities in Russia, China, Germany, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. He has an MA in public administration and coursework for a PhD from the University of Minnesota and has studied public policy as a Bush Fellow at Harvard and urban planning at the University of Manchester, England. He is one of the founders of Global Volunteers and has been their treasurer and representative at the United Nations and serves on their board of trustees. Todd has also been a member of Twin Cities Metropolitan Council, the Regional Transit Board, the Minnesota Experimental City Authority, and he is currently chairperson of the Russian American Business and Culture Council. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of Ramsey County Library, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. We're deeply grateful to all of these organizations for their support in bringing these talks to our communities. And now I'll turn things over to our speaker, Todd Lefko. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be back at Ollie, and I've enjoyed over the years working with Ollie and the program, which is and frankly, the audiences are one of the best in the world. I'm reminded when I do talks about climate change about when my daughter was young, and there used to be at the Uptown Theater in Minneapolis, there was the Turkey Film Festival, which was the festival of all the worst films ever made. Now, the worst of all time was Plan 9 from Outer Space with Bela Lugosi. That's definitely the worst. Then there was The Terror of Tiny Town, which was the idea, the only, thankfully, all midget Western musical. And I say that thankfully. And then there was the idea of my favorite film, which we still kid about, which was the idea of the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. And the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes were things modified the environment. And all these tomatoes came raining down. And the phrase from that my daughter and my daughter's a professor at Humboldt University in Berlin now, but we always have this joke that goes on about, hasn't the weather been strange recently? Which was the phrase from the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. And when you look at the past winter in Minnesota, and the fact that 8 out of the warmest years in history, in the recorded history, have been among the last 8 years, that the last time the planet was this warm was 125,000 years ago, which some days I remember from my childhood, where it seems that you start to realize that something's happening. There is an anthropogenic process which is going on. And the question is, there are a number of questions that come up, and we'll get into those. But the issue becomes, you won't get the right answer unless you ask the right questions. One of the problems that's been happening is that many of the issues in terms of climate change have been there for a long time. But I've developed a theory that what happens, there's something in human nature that we don't realize something until it's gone. whether it's the idea of age or relationships or the idea of health, that we look back on things, but we lack sometimes the perception to be able to look forward, to determine what things are happening. You can go back to 1856, which was the first climate experiment, the idea of Eunice Newton Foote, who took two glass cylinders, put carbon dioxide into one, and then the other one she put regular air in. She put them out in the sun. The carbon dioxide container warmed twice as fast as the regular air process. Secondly, in 1938, the English inventor Guy Callender stated that basically the activities of man, the anthropocentric activities, could basically change the entire planet. He was generally ignored, and it was at that point the parts per million of CO2 were roughly 311. Now it's 421 and rising rapidly. We're in a situation where, in terms of population, we're at roughly 8.1 at the moment. By 2050, it'll be somewhere between 9.5 and 10 point something, though there are some theories that basically it'll start to drop at that point. What you're seeing is the idea that all of the factors are relatively negative. Even by 2050, 60 some percent of all of our energy will basically not be alternative energies. They'll basically be fossil fuels. So this is going to be a slow process. And the question becomes, in Minnesota, we theoretically have a value that by 2040, we're going to be 100% based on the idea of non-fossil fuels. Frankly, we're not going to make it. And you watch the idea of the standards that were set up in Paris at the climate conferences of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase have already been passed. And so the question is now, how much beyond 2.0 are we going to go? So the questions that come up are fairly basic, not just in the idea of the weather, but the needs for the future and the idea of how do we respond and how do we ask the questions. Now, what I'm going to go through first are some of the questions. Then we'll start talking about some of the impacts on climate, because all of this becomes like an integrated process. You build systems. And the question is that we have not built a system of supply and governance to the way to protect ourselves. And you're seeing more and more of what's called climate nationalism, where countries are trying to protect themselves at the very moment that we need to work together. But we don't appear to be smart enough or have the ability to be able to do that. So if this winter was one indicator, and one of the questions that comes up is, when does something that's a momentary indicator become part of the process of a long-term trend? And you've had times in the past when you've had cold periods or warm periods, and that some became the indicators for long-term, others became just short-term reflections. But you don't know that until the time has passed. So we begin with the idea, number one, the threat is there. Number two, we're having an impact. Number three, we haven't developed the institutions basically to resolve that. Number four, we're facing geopolitical problems and other problems in terms of rare earths and the things that a growing population and a change in technology require that we have to face. And number five, that we sit there and we are in a period in which we don't trust each other. And we'll cover all of those, because when you're talking about things like climate, it's not just the question of what the temperature is today, in the Twin Cities. It's the question about what does that mean as part of a longer term process. So Grayson, hopefully I will be able to do this. Grayson, am I on the screen for my Zoom?
So if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen with the green share screen button.
Okay, now let me. Okay,
there we go.
Go
Perfect.
to, am I okay at the moment?
Yep. That looks great.
Okay. I was kidding with them before that I'm giving lectures on the impact of new technologies and different systems in the world, but I'll be darned if I can do it, because I've realized that most technologies are generational, and that knowing what the impact is a lot different than being able to do it. If I have real problems, I call my grandchildren. because they're the ones that actually know everything. And they remind me of that on a regular basis also. Okay, let me move this over and make it smaller on this. Okay, now, there are climate deniers, but frankly, I'm going to start with the assumption that all of us realize that something is happening. And the question becomes, it doesn't happen equally across the world. If you're sitting on an island in the South Seas, that is, or the Maldives, where the highest point is 6 feet above the ocean, and you're saving money so that you can move your entire population, that's an immediate issue. You've got issues here of location. As the sea rises, there's expectations that if the Greenland shelf breaks, the sea rise will be a couple of feet. Now, you've got 40% of Americans that are living close to the coast. So downtown New York, Miami, LA, places like that will be flooded. And I used to regret the fact in Minnesota that we basically weren't close to an ocean. And I realized that if I wait long enough, it may happen. And so, and when the days that land in Florida will be unbelievably cheap again, because a good share of it will be flooded, the impacts of climate change are not happening evenly at the same moment for everybody across the world. Secondly, is that we have reactions based individually, regionally, and globally. You start to see the idea that the US Census Bureau estimated that 32 million Americans were displaced or evacuated due to natural disasters in 2022. Of more than 500,000 had not returned at the beginning of 2023. The International Displacement Monitoring Center, over 376 million people around the world were forcibly displaced by floods, windstorms, earthquakes, or droughts since 2008, with a record 32.6 million in 2022. And the estimates right now are that over 216 million could migrate within their own countries as a result of climate change by 2050. Many of these are from rural areas where, due to sensitive sectors such as agriculture, fishing, or due to sea rises in densely populated coastal areas, their lives are being affected. And as they move, you get into issues of migration and political changes in reaction, whether it's the idea of people coming north from Latin America across Texas, or the idea of migrants from Africa and Central and the Mediterranean region going into Europe, which are causing political fights in almost every nation, there in Europe. And so you're starting to see it's this idea that everything has a secondary and tertiary impact. And the question becomes, how do we recognize that where something that's an individual cause for movement becomes part of a global impact of fights and arguments, which is not always understood, or defined uniformly. A threat happening across the world does not appear to be important to us, but it is. And so the questions that are there that we begin with: do we have control? There's a theory that at a certain point when the temperature rises, we've lost control, that the process is so much in effect, that basically we've missed the chance. Are we too late? And there are some who believe that we do. Do we have the capacity as humans to react to threats before it's too late? And that's a serious issue, because quite frankly, if we don't believe we have a chance or an alternative, what do we do? There are some that are building shelters in New Zealand because they think that's the last place that'll be reactive, but we're not all going to move to New Zealand. There's a theory that Minnesota will eventually look like Kansas because the tree line will be moving north. I don't know about you, but I didn't plan to live in Kansas, and it was for good reasons. And so what happens is, question, what are the secondary impacts of any action in terms of governance? If the houses on the East Coast are replaced because of windstorms and ocean rise, do we have the responsibility in Minnesota to pay for them? If the places in Phoenix and California are depending upon the Colorado River supply, and what they want to do is ship water from Minnesota. Should we accept that they would take our water so they can survive, or that their air conditioning can operate? Because air conditioning and the growth of it are going to be one of the major factors as heat starts to increase, and we'll talk about heat increase in a minute. The idea of economics, who's impacted? The estimates right now are that the global heat in the last number of years has cost the global economy and GDP roughly $16 trillion. So this is an economic impact of money that could have been spent on something else. The culture, do we start to shift to the idea that you don't go outside because it's too hot? Communications about who speaks with whom. The idea of land use, where in the Twin Cities, when I was on the Met Council, we flooded near the Mississippi River so many years that we'd have to rescue the people. We finally just bought the land and made it parks. The idea of migration, both nationally and internationally, and the process of decision making. Are people smart enough to basically set up a process internationally? Because what's happened is we're going through a process right now where the international issues that we're seeing in terms of pandemics, climate change, terrorism, the idea of communications are all moving up to an international level, where at the same time, political pressure is forcing decision-making down to a national and subnational level. We're separating the ability to make decisions from most of the issues that are arising as things that we have to face at the moment. And so we don't have an international architecture that basically can face a lot of the issues that we are facing because they're international. And the UN is a wonderful place for discussions, and they have great lunchrooms, but they're not solving the problems because they don't have the capability, because one or two nations have the ability to block the action of the UN because of the way we set it up based upon standards in 1945. And standards have changed and the challenges have changed. What are the choices? Do we have the financial and technological capability to choose wisely and rapidly? We have money, and we appear to have money for anything we wish to do. But the question is, how do you judge risk when different people have different risks? What are the true costs and benefits? How do you estimate what the cost is of replacing an entire society that's lived on an island for 2,000 years? Or the idea of a coastal city. If you're trying to replace New York City, what's the true cost of that? The required actions, the roles of individuals and governments. We kid about the idea that, yes, if you sit there and all the local communities put out a thing about do not put on your watering systems in your yards today. And everybody figures, okay, if I do it, somebody else won't, and it'll balance out and it'll be okay. And what happens is, if you have millions of people that decide not to water, it has an impact. One person is unbelievably small, but one person magnified many times has a great impact. And what happens if we make the wrong choice? We're sitting there. There's a theory now that you can get rid of CO2 by opening up the atmosphere and sort of allowing a process of experimentation upon the atmosphere where we allow gases to release. If they're wrong, we basically have screwed up our own supply system for protection. And so if you make wrong systems, and we're going through this fight now, as we'll see in Minnesota, and on the fights on discussions, one of the major issues now in energy is nuclear, and whether we should adopt some of the newer, smaller plants that got us away from the decisions under Carter and others, basically to stop the use of nuclear energy, is that if we've made the wrong choice, we've got 5,000 to 10,000 years to correct it, but which of us is going to be around in the 5,000 years to be able to save the planet, assuming we can at that point? How do we basically respond to pessimistic issues? If you believe the world is going to hell, and there are many in the world that believe that, what do we do if we believe that any of our actions have no impact? The psychology, we've built a system in the West based upon the idea that we're future oriented. right now in Russia, the saying, one of the sayings that I love is the idea in Russia, the future is easy to know. It's the past which continually changes. And so they've got a nation which is focused upon the past and a perceived set of glories. We sit there and for years, we believe that everything, with progress comes the passage of time, and passage of time produces progress. If that's not a set of our Western beliefs, what is it we believe in? And you're seeing that fight politically at this moment between parties and different philosophical groups that are there, across the world and across the nation. The impact of information shaping attitudes. Right now, if you can't believe what you see, and with artificial intelligence and the idea of virtual reality, half the people in the country don't believe what the other half are saying. We're watching the idea. Look at what happened during pandemics, where a good share of the population didn't believe that there really was anything you could do. Did it have an impact on the length of the pandemic? You betcha. We're seeing this idea, the theory of crisis of crises, that we have so many different crises going on at once that people do what I call, they surrender to Netflix. They say, I can't handle all of these things at once. We can't chew gum and walk at the same time. And so the question is, with all of these different crises, because you can go nuts with all of the different factors that are threats across the world, if you can't handle many of them at once, and very few people can, how do we respond? And do we just shut it off and pray that they go away? How do we understand the potentially destructive forces? In a world of political decisions where nobody speaks to each other, I'm sitting there, and one of the interesting things, Gallup poll, which started in 2006, testing the idea of what kinds of positive impacts were there in the United States on trust in the future. What happened was 20 years ago, the US had the highest trust level of any G7 nation, which is the wealthiest nations. Now it's the lowest. We're tied with the Italians. There's a loss of faith in honest elections. The Army's still high at 81%, but now US trust in armed forces is lower than any point since 2006. And the point that's here is the idea that if you believe that the world is collapsing, it starts to have other impacts. And it splits between parties. The Republicans have more faith in the idea of the army, the police, and religion. The Democrats tend to have more trust in the idea of journalism, higher education, and science. And you're watching that the institutions are becoming increasingly homogenized, which we're watching in higher education right now, as well as in the idea of conservatives supporting a politically conservative military service. And so you start to see the idea of trust in institutions, the idea of filing their tax returns. During COVID, people who had high trust in government were more likely to get vaccinated and comply with public health guidance on lockdowns or social distancing. The blind trust in authority is dangerous. And yet we have to have some trust in the institutions we've set up. And during periods in which we've lost faith in the value of truth because of the numbers of crises and the fact of a loss of faith in institutions, how do we basically agree upon choices that are there? Now, there's realistic challenges. The Minnesota winter, the record-breaking high temperatures. I kidded that March came in like a lamb, and then they decided to have winter for a week or two. But it was a great winter, except for the fact if you were a farmer and the snow and the other water quantities for your next crops didn't appear. So it was going to be a terrible crop year, which is what happened in a good share of Minnesota. We had large wildfires. We're sitting there where the process is our air pollution increases because of changes in ocean climates and ocean currents, which meant that the temperature, the use of airflows and wildfires in Canada were suddenly coming across Minnesota. Can you imagine? They didn't even know where the border was. You know, and I'm being facetious here, but it's this idea that here's a situation where we're suffering because of climate, because of current changes in the Pacific, which are affecting Canada. There is no better example of the idea about how issues are spreading. So you start to get the idea that in some areas you get floods, other areas you get drought. And all of these are happening across the United States and across in California, where you're having record flooding, or the idea about in Maine or some of the other areas where flooding, and areas like we were going through with drought. And so what happens is the question of impact starts to change wherever you are, you know, at that moment. Let me go to the next page here. Come on, Lefko. Let's see. Okay, now, not all power is the same. The fact that you have more electricity doesn't matter in terms of the oil processes that you get. We're bringing in 4 million gallon or barrels of oil from Canada per day right now. We're still importing a small percentage of our things from the Middle East or out of Venezuela or other countries. So, but in terms of the idea of electricity or the idea of things for your home or for many businesses, that's irrelevant. Because quite frankly, but in transportation, you're still running 90% of transportation is done with petroleum, but only 1% of electric power. Now, you're starting to see as population increases from the 8.1 to basically 9.5, the demand for a few things go up. In India, the mark of being middle class is the idea of air conditioning. You're starting to watch the idea every 3 days, somewhere in the world, a new data center is being established, which demands a great level of both energy and water usage. In Minnesota, we'll be building a large one up in Becker, which will basically demand a large water concentration and water use. So the idea, when someone says that, okay, we can get rid of oil, and shift to solar, unless it can be adapted to some of the other systems, basically, it's not the essential question. Right now, we're getting 30%. We're getting gas and coal account for about 81% of total U.S. primary energy production. 36% from natural gas, 31% from petroleum, 13% from renewable energy, 12% from coal, and 8%. We're still getting 8% from nuclear electric power. And we're going to talk in a minute about the idea. There is a request now because a number of other nations are shifting back to the idea of nuclear energy because some of the newer systems are producing safer waste and they're producing less waste, right now. So we've had fossil fuels that have dominated for the last 100 years. The mix has changed though. In 1977, petroleum basically was 48% of all the energy consumption. Now it's a little less than 36%. We start to see fights. And one of the issues that's coming up is that policies like tax policies, governmental choices on taxes for things like solar panels or investments in solar fields, or the idea of siting factors for how long it takes, and start to determine, do people make an investment in something because they know they can judge what their level of risk and return on investment start to be. Now, you're getting into questions that start to go broader, because if you're siting a new facility in an area such as northern Minnesota or central Minnesota, the average siting process is 12 years. And when you get into some of the political fights, you're talking about 16 years. Now, for major investors the return needs to be roughly, it will end up being about 7%. They can get 5.6, 5.8% by investing in corporate bonds. And so everybody wants to see what your return on investment is before you're going to put money into something. Now, you're sitting in a situation in which they can choose not to get any return for the next 12 to 16 years or put their money somewhere else, which means there's going to be a shortage of the investment required for us to shift over to a number of the other larger facilities, that we need to get away from, and do the kinds of facilities. And in Minnesota, especially when you get into fights in northern Minnesota, near Babbitt and Twin Metals and things like that, it's going to be a much longer process. Or I have a theory that you're not going to see any major nuclear plants for the next, for as long as we can imagine, just because the political reaction from the past, you don't even discuss it. So the process for siting is going to be on a much longer basis. So the question starts to be, how do you get the investment? How do you change the siting process to provide safety and security and the idea it's not going to affect your water supply? How do you basically do this when most of your society doesn't believe the idea of scientific responses, and you don't have scientific responses for a lot of the elements that you need, to guarantee that your water safe, the water in northern Minnesota, in terms of, you've got 20% of all fresh water in the world up in the Great Lakes. You've got 10 to 20% of the fresh water in America tied to northern Minnesota. And so if you've made a mistake, you've screwed it up for the next number of years. And so the question is everything from investment to knowing what the best choices are. In Germany, they do a guaranteed tax rate on solar panels for roughly 8 years before they'll change the law. In America and the United States, in America and places of the states, you don't know from year to year if the difference in political decision making will change the law on tax policy for the next year. We've become short term. And for the idea of investments in things like solar panel and long-term factories, you need to have some kind of guarantee on a longer term basis. But in a society which has become short term in terms of their concept of timing, we've missed that. And we've lost that. And there's something wrong, I think both morally and in terms of planning, with that. Let me go to the next slide. Okay. Fossil fuels, roughly 80 to 81% of primary energy production. And I went through some of the numbers that are there. Top 4 industries are chemical, petroleum and coal, paper, metals. The wasted energy, we waste about 2/3 of the fuel that we put into power plants. And transportation, we waste about 80%. If we could cut down on the use of waste, because often we're inefficient. Secondly, we sit there and I did a study once. I became fascinated with how many batteries did I have in my house and how many things such as computers were plugged in, or lights that were plugged, or TVs, refrigerators, stoves that were plugged in all night, weren't being used, but were still using energy. I was amazed at how many things had batteries in my house, which leads to the third thing, is that there's enough sunlight that falls on the earth in 90 minutes that you could fill all of the needs for energy for 1 year. 90 minutes. But the process becomes, how do you save it? Because one of the issues of batteries are the idea about reserving for low flow periods when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, and we don't have that. We've got short-term abilities to provide that for a short period. But if we change the system of batteries and the idea of being able to reserve energy for longer periods, or the idea of cutting down on waste, we totally change the economics and the process of energy supply in the United States. And that's being done slowly. And I emphasize slowly, because often they're done on small bases, such as the use of hydrogen. It can be done on an individual basis for a very small number of people. It cannot be done on the idea of a citywide or nationwide basis, even though hydrogen, green hydrogen or golden hydrogen would change the process completely and provide the answers, that we need in a non-toxic fuel basis. Okay, now, Minnesota is and will be one of the largest centers of fights over rare earths. There are 17 rare earths that we use, lithium and others, that we decided not to do and develop because the environmental costs of mining were so great and processing that we were afraid of the environmental impact upon the citizens of the United States. So we sent it to China. We sent it to Bolivia or other places because we figured if they died, such is life, we were protecting ourselves. And I'm being slightly facetious here, but there was that impact because I was sitting in the DFL caucuses, and the first motion was to ban all mining in northern Minnesota. And I raised my hand and I said, if you're forcing the people in Bolivia to die is instead of the idea of doing anything here, is that really a solution? And there was silence in the room. We start to see Minnesota, and you've watched the fight over twin metals. Right now, Minnesota is one of the largest deposits of nickel, cobalt, and other metals. We've got 95% of the United States' known nickel reserves. We've got 88% of the cobalt, 75% of the platinum group reserves, 34% of the copper. Many are in the Superior Natural Forest, which is home to 20% of the fresh water in natural forests, serve us. Right now, we've got this idea where if we've made a mistake because of the underground water connection systems in terms of mining, we've screwed up a good share of northern Minnesota. And so the question starts to be, and these processes that we're talking about in the boundary waters and the areas near there, one project is talked about being 30,000 acres. The city of St. Paul is 36,000 acres, to give you a concept of relative relationships. There's a new issue which has arisen in the past year, which nobody believed was going to happen. They were mining and doing studies on cobalt, either nickel or cobalt. They came across near Babbitt a flow of helium, which nobody thought was going to be in Minnesota, except for on unbelievably small units. The thing that amazed people was a unit of land which has 3% in terms of the minerals that are in helium is solid. Minnesota's helium had 10%, which nobody believed was possible from a sighting. Now, one of the problems is that the Department of Health does things like boreholes, and they do studies like the idea about some of the mining holes. The Department of Natural Resources does studies and sets regulations in terms of the idea of mining and water protection. They have no rules and standards for helium because nobody thought there'd be any helium. Now, helium is used in space exploration, MRIs, as well as in the idea of Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola in terms of CO2. And the helium adds the gas. And so they could probably do one container a week at least and ship it around. Probably most of it would go to Pepsi-Cola or Coca-Cola or drinks. But the question is, how do we build standards on a very quick basis? And they're doing it this month of determining that helium is safe in terms of the idea of mining, and it's not going to have an impact upon water and other supplies. And for those of us that are in the Twin Cities, everybody in the Twin Cities wants to save northern Minnesota. But you're sitting there, and for these people, it's the question of whether they're going to have any money because they've been laid off from some of the mines, and there are not a lot of job options. So for them, it's a personal thing. And one of the things you're watching is the split between rural and urban Minnesota, the Twin Cities and the rest of the state, because different standards are being applied, the kinds of things that we decide we need now in terms of metals and the other potential sources that we don't understand, that we're all part of one system. So we're watching this idea that the decarbonizing global economy requires rare earths and metals. Between now and 2050, we'll require 6.5 billion tons of metals. And it's not just lithium, and nickel, but 170 million tons a year of steel, mostly from iron ore, which a good share of which comes from Minnesota, which is 10 times the current global production. So it's the issue of timing, it's the issue of investment required, and the question about when people have choices with their money, what do they do with it? I'm in a project in Kazakhstan now where I'm on the advisory committee for the management university, and we're trying to change the economy of Kazakhstan basically to innovation. So we've set up a proof of concept center there with a number of my friends at the university. And my friend is the director of the project, and I'm on as one of his advisors on this. We're starting to see where you go into an economy which has operated for years off of dictatorship and the idea of agrarian, but you've got a base to shift to the idea of innovation. Countries can do this for themselves all over the world if they're encouraged and you have the right policy. So we're testing this in Central Asia to see whether this works. And hopefully, hopefully Minnesota will also start to do that, because I worry about whether we've gotten away from long-term planning in Minnesota. And it's a serious issue here. We're not thinking about the idea about the impacts of what we do today determine what we do in the long run. Okay, so we start to watch the issue of the amount of heat which is generated by the consumption of fossil fuels. The ocean absorbs the equivalent of the heat released from 3 nuclear bombs every second, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. It's not going to cool off. If we stop today from emitting CO2, it will still continue to go for a period. And so we can stop the increase, but we don't reverse it. So we've got to figure out a way, and some of it is the idea of putting and trying to trap CO2 underground. And there are a number of theories and some programs for doing this now. There are some that are the idea of releasing it out of the sky. But like I said, if you've done wrong, we don't know how to reverse it if we've screwed it up. The heat that we're pumping into the sky is the prime mover of climate crisis. Now, these are second order. Everything has a first, second, and third order and beyond impact of actions. So the idea of a hotter planet melts the glaciers, which increases sea rise, which helps to give rise to drought, to wildfires, which means migratory changes. And so you see this idea that every action that we've done for years becomes the basis of actions that are happening now, and everything we're doing now will start to shape the future. So it's not the question of just planning, it's the question of actually doing this. So the effects of heat are both slow and fast. You get the wheat fields that are parched. You start to get the months of heat that pulls moisture from the ground. All of these things, the reverse evaporation. I've developed a theory that every system, starting in science and going towards social organization, develops entropy. It slows down. Jefferson had a theory that you needed a revolution every 30 years in government, basically to provide for renewal. And we're talking about the idea of resilience and the idea about how to rebuild a system, because the nature of the power of the United States relative to others in the world, and in a period in which semi-isolationism is coming back as a foreign policy factor, how do you basically do things that are becoming more international right now? And we're seeing the fight in Congress, over that. So as the temperature rises, population increases, migration, a number of plants and animals start to disappear. We're seeing a change in the factors that are involved and are basically producing the questions of what do we do and how much time realistically do we have. So we start, what I'm going to do is going for about another 10 or 12 minutes, and then I'm going to shift and we'll start doing questions, if that's okay. So context of issues around leadership. Where are the leaders in the United States and the world? We have wonderful international conferences that start to declare standards that everybody wants everyone else to pay for. And there's an old saying that you will always have Peter's support for any solution that Paul pays for. And that's what we're doing, is everybody wants the United States to pay for it. And if you're sitting there in the South Pacific or a number of countries like Pakistan, you don't have the money to basically do the major shifts that are required. The shiftings of major issues internationally in the political press downward, which I talked about, the idea of optimism and pessimism, the role of time, how much time do we really have? And when you're talking about 12 to 16 years to basically site a plant, how do you maintain the process through that without a lot of money and without the ability to build something? The role of the dollar. For us, we've been supporting the system because we're the only nation that basically is able to print a dollar. Oil is denominated over 60% in dollars, which is one of the reasons that the Chinese are trying to shift this to yuan or renminbi, or the idea the Russians would love to have rubles, but it's not going to happen. Though the idea of doing baskets, you're seeing a shift away from the dollar now in terms of remuneration for oil across the world, which is weakening the position of the United States financially across the world, because the dollar remuneration basically increased the power of Washington relative to other states. The question of private-public relationships. You're seeing the fact that Congress passed, when Biden came in and they passed the idea of the major investments over $1 trillion in new technologies. So you're starting to see plants reshoring or basically being built, where TSMC, you've got 90% or more of all the advanced chips in the world being done in Taiwan in one factory. There are smaller plants there are smaller chips that are being done across the world that we're using, but not for the most advanced units of AI. If anything happened with the Chinese bombing that factory, we'd all be in deep trouble. So we've convinced, because of tax breaks, we've convinced TSMC to build plants in Arizona, which is a longer term thing, which eventually will help us, but not at this moment. We start to see the idea where government, capitalist government, is moving more toward the idea of government controlled decision, because anytime you make the decision about who gets investment money, or the idea about which factories are adopted as the idea of the alternatives in some technology, you are making a decision of winners and losers. And theoretically in capitalism, we're supposed to have this competition. That's not working out here. We're moving more toward the idea of a government process for control, of this. So the nature of public-private relationships and the whole question of what capitalism reflects is basically, being changed. We're starting to see the impact of new technologies, whether it's the idea of batteries, or I sat through a discussion of the use of black fly larvae as a replacement for lithium iron in batteries, or the idea of the use of solar waves in space to renew energy on satellites in the world, and they're being developed, but they're slow and they have a long way to go. It's like the idea of hydrogen. We can do it on a small scale. We cannot magnify it fast enough to solve the problems. So you get into fights over geopolitics about the idea that if we cut off China, China can cut us off from the idea of rare earths. This works two ways. And so what you're getting is you're getting what's called geographical and climate nationalism, where you're getting a Bolivia with copper, where that is the only resource they have. So that what they do is they try and limit it, or the idea of Saudi Arabia that tries to limit the idea of supply, or in the Middle East with UAE and Dubai and the other countries that are trying to limit this. And they're becoming the major investor in most alternatives because they know that this will run out in the next 30 to 40 years at best in terms of most of the fossil fuels, and they want to make sure that they're at the center of the new economy. But at the moment, they're trying to slow down the process as much as possible to make sure that they can control the pricing by OPEC and by the other, and OPEC Plus, which are the other agreements with Russia and the other nations that are involved in this. You're seeing fights now over the rules of law acceptance and the fairness. What becomes fair? We were sitting there during pandemics where we had enough material and shots for 11 shots per person, where in much of Africa they had 0. What becomes fair in this? And usually in international relationships, it's a question of power, not fairness. But it should be fairness, because we're all part, global. If something happens to the climate here, we don't go somewhere else. We're not going to Mars. And if we do, it'll be very few of us. What's power in the world anymore? Power, whether it's the idea of electric power or the idea of military power. If some nut can sit in a cave in Pakistan, Osama bin Laden, and plan 9/11, and somebody sitting thousands of miles from us can basically control practically all of our information systems now are run through the computer system, through the internet. So whether it's the idea of finance or the idea of power systems or the idea of most information, I've thought about the idea that if you're sitting there in a structure where you can control power thousands of miles away, when we were fighting in Iraq, the decisions were coming out of our military center in Florida. If you're sitting in a process where you can sit thousands of miles away and shut down the power systems in another place in the world, do an extra 5,000 soldiers or an extra aircraft carrier matter? No, they don't. The nature of power has changed to technology and information. And if you can control information where people actually believe you, we get into fights both in Russia and Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza over the question of control of narratives. People, and you watch the fights on college campuses because the information that people choose to adopt, that's power. So I was in a discussion last week with people from around the world on the idea of civilizational changes. If the society is growing like in 1980, in Orwell's 1984, to the concept that basically we're seeing a Chinese-Russian relationship that's controlling information. You're seeing a group in Europe, a group in the United States, and then other groups that are basically coming in and out of parts of the other 3 major groupings. Does that change the way information is trusted and shared? Yes. Which starts to cut down on the relationships that we need for the idea of facing joint problems together. The role of a shared morality. We're starting to see different concepts of everyone wants the world. Putin wants us to adopt the idea of all conservative relationships that he believed Russia reflects from the idea of 120 or 150 years ago. We don't want to. And you're seeing this idea because of a definition of history, which in many cases never really existed, become the essence of fights that become wars. Do ethics matter? And I'm sometimes wondering whether ethics matter anymore, and they should. Is a system open or closed to new ideas? Is this a closed system, and are we developing that? And there are people politically here that want us to close off systems. The impact of religion and ethics, the fights between Sunni and Shia throughout the Middle East, the fights that are reflected in the idea of arguments between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the control of the narrative by new communication technologies. Right now, we've shifted from a concept where when I was growing up at 5:30 at night, you'd all get together because the voice of God would be passed to you through Walter Cronkite, because Walter Cronkite was the most trusted person in America and basically told you the truth. Right now, you've got 4 billion people with cell phones that are gatherers, distributors, and interpreters of the truth. and everybody picks out their own decision of the truth that they start to believe. So the question of trust in institutions, the question of trust in government. I mean, right now, when you've got Congress running at a rate lower than practically anyone, including used car salespeople, in Europe, in my daughter's class in Berlin, a good share of the students are from across Europe. What you're watching is an interesting process where they believe that Washington is dysfunctional and that the United States can't really make decisions. And some days it's really hard to disagree with them. You start to see this idea of fights between globalism and globalization and the idea of neo-isolationism. And yet, I once assigned my class to go to Target, and they had to find every bit of clothing that was made in the United States. It was a quick trip. And so we've globalized a number of things in terms of restaurants and travel, and the idea about how the ability for materials. I mean, I used to kid that if you set up a Japanese auto factory in Tennessee, but the engines are coming from England and they're going back and forth between plants set up in Mexico, Canada, and the United States, is the car produced in Tennessee Japanese or is it American? And the answer is clearly yes. That it's basically part of a new system because we get parts from all over the world. And this idea about how do we perceive whether we're part of a larger system or we're tribal? I used to ask my students at the university, I'd say, what are you a citizen of? And I draw them a set of concentric circles. And I'd say, okay, you're in Hennepin County, but you're part of the Twin Cities, you're part of the state of Minnesota, you're part of the United States, and you're part of the world. Now, on some things, we're Minnesotans. If we're playing Iowa or Wisconsin in football, we're Minnesotans. If we're playing Germany at the Olympics, we're all part of a larger, that's the idea, we're all Americans at that point. So we have different definitions of who we are, and there's a theory in social psychology that you define yourself based upon how you define others. It's the psychology of the others, where you decide that you're not Jewish, you're not Black, you're not female, you're not, a blank, 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 and that's how you define who you are, of whom you're not. And so the question becomes, we have different sets of values on some things, on things like climate change. We're citizens of the world. Because quite frankly, when the smoke can come from Canada, national borders have no relationship anymore. They don't matter. And so the question is, do we have the institutional architecture to deal with some of the changing realities, of the world? And the answer is no at this point. So with the question with attention, you've got wars in the Middle East, pandemics, you've got Ukraine, the complexity of changing the renewables from fossil fuels, the impact upon trade, where we have to decide who's our friend and where we get supplies from, which is one of the reasons we're reshoring. I never thought I'd live to see the day when China became too expensive to produce things, but you're seeing a shift out of China to Southeast Asia. I mean, the concept of time, if somebody had told you in 1975 that Vietnam would now be our major partner in the region, if somebody had told you in 1945 that Berlin and Tokyo would be our two major allies in the world, would you have believed it? And so the question upon impact upon who's our friend this week, the idea of migration, politics, economy, power, shipping needs, where you're sitting there because the Houthis are attacking in the Red Sea, we're shipping parts of, at least 10 to 12% of all oil goes through the Red Sea. So we're sitting there and we're starting to ship around Africa, which is a much more expensive process because the ability of the Houthis, which are basically an Iranian front, start to impact whether our ships can go through there. And so we've started sending aircraft carriers from the United States into the Red Sea to protect shipping needs of other nations and ourselves. You start to see all of these questions that are coming up at once. And you start to see the idea of ships that are being designed with wind sails so they can cut down on the use of the needs they've got. Let me mention one other thing and then I'll open it up. Nuclear. Nuclear is roughly 8%. And weirdly enough, the largest producer of uranium for nuclear is Rosatom, which is the Russian nuclear facility and the trade company. One of those weird impacts of fate, and I'm becoming more fascinated with the concept of fate here. The person who's the representative of Rosatom lives in Arden Hills or somewhere in Minnesota, because I had breakfast with him one day last year, and an incredibly nice guy. But so what you're watching is the idea, new smaller factories are being developed because of the cutoff of Russian oil into Europe. A number of the plants, including past nuclear and coal-fired, are being continued, where in a normal process they would be phased out, but now they're being continued and money's being put into them, which means less money is going into the idea of potential new nuclear plants or the idea of fossil fuels such as solar, wind, and hydro. So you're seeing the fact that oil is being cut off because of a fight in Ukraine, impacting the continuation of fossil fuel methods throughout Europe and some other places. You're starting to see large numbers of often Russian-designed nuclear plants being set up in Africa and other places in the Middle East, because they try to guarantee that that's a safer process. Because of the situations in what's happened on 3 Mile Island and other places, that I don't believe that you could even have a serious conversation politically about this. I tell the story about my wife, and my wife was one of the top Russian mathematicians. Her then husband, because both of us were married before, her then husband comes to her and says, "I've got a job, and I'm going to be running one of these nuclear power plants." And he was in the power ministry. And she said, "No, I'm teaching in Moscow at Moscow State, which is the Harvard of Russia." And she said, "I refuse to go." So they turned the job down. And 2 months later, the small town with the plant called Chernobyl blew up. And because of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and what's happened in Japan, nations started to, like Germany, started to cut off all nuclear plants. They're now restarting some of those plants. And people have a short-term memory. And so my sense is that what we've seen is that there are some solutions that are potential in time, that this is going to be a slow process, that no process is without cost. The sun and the wind don't always operate. The battery power and its access is not evenly distributed. There's a move toward electricity as a basic delivery process with the idea of batteries in cars. But the way things are going for the electronic vehicles and Musk and Tesla at the moment, this is not, the future appears to be further away than it was before. And the question of efficiency for batteries, which is being improved, which means you can make smaller batteries and change the design of the cars and go longer, without refueling. And at that point, you have to really build up the system, because in a lot of places, they don't have refueling systems when you get into rural Minnesota or rural, rural North Dakota or someplace like that. You've got to build a whole system like that. So to questions of danger, timing, cost, responsibility, morality for sharing, governance, and the idea of technology all come into play with what appears to be a simple issue about how do you get away from a process which we've set up for 100 years to something which is safer, and to something which basically provides a solution for everybody, and that's needed. That's the issue at the moment. And like I said, the issue are a number of issues, and until people can have a concept that this is an interrelated system that we built by ourselves. And we've changed the process of who we are and where we are. I mean, somebody once asked me, what do you think a fish thinks about water if it had to describe it? We don't think about air until there's something wrong. That's what's happening right now. And so the question becomes, how do we solve that? So, Kay, let me try and get the pictures back up and see if I can put this. Oh, come on, Lefko. And let me see if I can put. Okay. Kay? Let's take questions or comments or prayers or whatever you think would be good.
Okay. First question is going back to looking at what corporations are doing. Is it fundamentally a question that you're getting at whether corporate persons have any social responsibility beyond increasing shareholders' profits?
Yes, obviously, yes. You know, that you've got two questions. One is the idea of incentives. You know, is what do you set up as a tax policy for them? Secondly, is you think about the logic of this. We're paying billions of dollars to the oil companies because we wanted to guarantee that there was a supply of relatively cheap energy for the United States. The oil companies are having their best years financially. So you and I are subsidizing all of the people that are already rich. And there's another factor that I didn't mention. There's a process of concentration of wealth that's happening both in the United States and across the world. So what's happening is that capitalism has worked for some people and not well for others. So the question is somebody once said that Christianity has not failed, it has never been attempted. You know, and right now, pure capitalism has never been attempted. We have a number of factors of socialism. We have municipal liquor, stores. We have public schools. We have the idea of the way we set up the tax policy, which if you're rich, you can affect because the lobbyists you can hire and the money you can give to campaigns. So if you set this up, it's a change in legislation. It's a change in tax policy. It's a different concept of who needs money and where tax policy is often created at 2:00 in the morning in Washington when the smaller groups have gone home and the larger groups lobbyists are still sitting in the room saying, do you remember the $100,000 we donated to you? And I'm sorry to sound crass, but that's the reality of what's happening with much legislation is that if you give large amounts, politicians do take your calls. You know, and that's unfortunately become a reality in the way the country's set up. And I don't say that with any sense of pride, but you know, I'm almost ashamed to say it. So the answer is yes, definitely, and that there's a group I'm in called CO, which is the idea of moral responsibility of private businesses, and they all do have a responsibility. The problem is that we've set up a system where people don't go toward the idea of long-term investment.
Mm-hmm.
You've got all these corporate gypsies that come into a corporation, they screw it up, they get a golden parachute of millions of dollars, and then they go on to a next corporation to screw that up. I mean, the logic of this, we benefit people that do poorly and that leave us. You know, in the way that the way that the internal processes are set up, nobody cares. I mean, the sadness of this is you don't have any Macmillans that are still involved basically, except for getting money at Cargill. You know, the Daytons, there aren't too many Daytons that are involved in Daytons anymore. You know, and these people lived here and they were us. You know, and so they should have that responsibility, but the nature of capitalism and the way corporations have changed, you know, you get somebody like an Alden Investment. that's basically the killer of all small newspapers in America. And 9 newspapers have closed in the last couple of weeks in rural Minnesota and in the suburbs, because Alden basically stripped them clean. That's to me, that's morally repugnant, the way this has been done. So there's a number of failures that are happening in corporate America, and a number of companies that are unbelievably good, that are investing and are doing things. But an interesting article in the Star Tribune last week, talking about the idea that a number of the foundations had been stopped by the corporations, where they still give money, probably not the same amount, but give money, but that their foundation sections had been destroyed. And because quite frankly, they were having pressures financially because of the changes in the economy. 3M, when I was on the Metropolitan Council, the 3M people, the lobbyist, who was a good guy, came to us and said, don't worry, all the stuff we're discharging is no problem. Right now, the fights over PFASs, which are the idea of the chemicals in the water, are basically helping. They're not bankrupting 3M, but they've totally changed the cash flow within 3M. And they screwed it up because nobody took a long-term view, and it's hurting them dramatically.
So it's going to follow up with when did short-term investment measures start? Was that the 80s or 90s? And the effect that was to incentivize short-term plans and ignore long-term.
Well, there's 2 factors here.
So
What is the idea of governmental policy and people understanding that there are tax incentives, and that everything they do in terms of tax policy changes the other decisions that a company will make or not make. I mean, as we used to kid, not to act is to act. And we choose in our personal life and in corporate and in government, we choose not to act and hope that something, will be done, or that somebody else will do it. One of my great frustrations when I was on the Metropolitan Council is I asked the wrong questions. We were having a discussion on sewers one day, and I asked the question, how much would it cost to totally redo the infrastructure of the Twin Cities? Because sewers are supposed to be set up for a 40 to 60 year period. Mars were at 80 years, and this was 30 years ago. And so we're sitting there, and one of the people looked at me and said, don't ask the question, because if we announce a figure, it'll scare the hell out of everybody. They'll be overwhelmed, and they'll figure, oh God, what do we do now? And so we start to see that first part becomes government, and you need leadership for that. And the problem is that everybody is focused on their own needs rather than the idea of longer term needs. We got rid of our state planning agency. You've got other groups that basically do it, the American Experiment, which does it for the idea of cutting government. You've got the Greater Minnesota, the Greater MSP, which does it for the idea about how good we are, but don't look at the bad things. You need to have somebody that looks at this from a neutral standpoint, which in the old days the Citizens League and other groups did, but they pretty much dissipated in terms of what, or basically been lost in terms of what they do. Secondly is the idea of the thing that we discussed first, excuse me, with the idea of corporate concept of responsibility, of how they fit in with it's a redefinition of who their stakeholders are. And it's not just their investors or their employees, but it's the idea of larger societal things where they're doing something. And it was like the idea, the first rule of medicine is do no harm. Whether it's the idea of chemicals. Right now, there's a huge fight over plastics because we're having this problem of waste in the oceans and in society, because the plastics, we've done such a good job with plastics that they last forever. And now we're trying to figure out, how do you do it? I mean, this whole thing, like shifting away from one kind of straw to another. When you're sitting there at Costco having a hot dog and Coke, and they're shifting the kinds of, straws that you use. I mean, these become both individual and societal across there. So, but what you're seeing is that you're unfortunately seeing elements of leadership coming in both government but they're not. There's a theory that ideas are tied to the context of the moment in history that you're discussing them. I mean, like I pointed out, 1856, the woman did the first experiment. 1938, they showed this as an impact. The idea of Silent Spring with Rachel Carson and others, this is not a new issue. But the question was, the moment wasn't correct to have enough of a political concentration of effort and interest to basically change the concepts. And that's why I talked about the idea that we seem to see things in retrospective. When something has hurt us, like the pandemic, then we think about this and then we forget about it. And then we think about this idea. There are all kinds of other things that are happening that may be pandemics in the future. But are we prepared? No, not really. Because some of it's a modification it takes a while to develop the vaccines and other things because of everything's a bit unique. But it's this idea that we should be smart enough to learn from our mistakes and our issues, and we're not. And one of the things that scares the dickens out of me is this idea about, is this part of the human nature? Is there something where we can't foresee, we can't plan and can't see it?
So, hey, one viewer pointed out that you jump past climate change deniers in your opening. What is a helpful strategy to talk to a denier in order to help them loosen up their mind and help them open up to understanding how the climate is changing?
Well, someone once suggested to me that we have euthanasia, but I suggested that wasn't a very practical solution because a lot of those people were good people too. And I'm being facetious here, really. But you get to the point where one of the issues that's happening is the question about when do people change their mind? There's a process called cognitive dissonance in communications theory. And it's the idea that once that we build filters in our mind, and it's like this thing where very quickly we develop a process that we analyze something, whether it's the idea about, is a person good or bad? They talk about the idea that many decisions are made for hiring in the first 20 seconds of an interview. Or the idea of, I got a note from a woman in Kazakhstan saying, I've applied for 9 programs. Nobody's even reading my resume. What should I do? And I told her, that you had to be unique on this because people make such a quick decision. And so what it is, you have to basically put things in a process where people understand the Minnesota winter, the idea of the fights over rare earths, the idea of the increased flooding that's happening in the coasts, and don't do it. What we've often done is this idea about people we disagree with. It's how can you be so dumb? That's not exactly the best way to build love or relationships, because there is, the question that cognitive dissonance shows is that most people are relatively rational. And the question starts to be, how do you put it into language that they understand, which is immediate for them? Because quite frankly, with the changes in information, the mistrust of science has become a major factor. There are some things, there's a Chinese philosopher, Lu Zhen, said, lies written in ink cannot disguise facts written in blood. You cannot disguise that something is happening across the world in terms of floods, droughts, the idea about climate change, heat. The idea right now, every 1 degree Celsius increase reduces corn output by 7%, wheat production by 6%, rice production by 3%. You're starting to see the idea of heat you're starting to see heat migration, where the idea of 70,000 people died in Europe in 2003 and 61,000 died in 2022 during the heat waves throughout Europe. Something is happening, and you don't have to say that the people hopefully have enough of a connection that something's happening that they have to deal with. And that these are things that you didn't make up. People died. And you're getting this question where the demand for electricity and resources are going to go up as the population adds an extra billion people. And just ask the question, so what do we do? And hopefully your friends or the others that you're discussing this with will start to make the connection. You're not telling them. You're asking them, you're showing what the facts are and having it. And this is I'm giving a talk next week on Russia and Ukraine. And this idea about how do you get to the fact that everybody loses? This is a dumb way to make international decisions, but we've done it for years. But at this point, everybody's going to lose, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, because nobody's going to have enough money to rebuild both countries. And I'm having these discussions almost on a daily basis with friends of mine in Russia. And it's not an easy discussion. The point is, there'll be some people, whoever asked this question, it's really an important issue because, quite frankly, there are some people you are not going to get across to. This is not where you're going to win every discussion, but it's just the fact that put it where the facts are there. I don't have all the answers, but I do know that we need to do something. And do you have any suggestions rather than just ignoring it?
Yeah. I was just thinking too, I have a cousin who just moved back to Michigan after living in Arizona for 30 years because it's gotten too hot during the summer there. She's just like, it's unbearable to live there anymore, and she never thought she'd move back to Michigan, but she did.
I was sitting there one day, I was working on an Indian reservation on the Mexican border with the Papago Nation, a wonderful group. And the Mexican border runs right through the middle of the village. And so I'm down there and I'm taking a group and I'm sitting there and I'm driving out of Phoenix toward the south. And we got to the end of the city, and on one side of the street, all the lawns were green because they were being watered. On the other side of the street was desert. And I kept thinking, would Phoenix exist without water from the Colorado River? And the answer was pretty clear. And I've thought about that because, quite frankly, LA wouldn't exist, without water. And in fact, there's stories about the Native Americans who used to sit hundreds of years ago and watch the smog and the smoke rise against where the early Spanish settlers were doing campfires. And the smoke would just hang in the air. And that should have told them something. But they built LA anyway because they had water and it was usually cheap water from somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay, well, we seem to get more of what we incentivize. If you were king, this person is asking, what incentives?
then all of you should basically leave the country at the moment.
If you were king, what incentives would you change that we currently have?
Well, probably I'd reestablish a better form than monarchy at the beginning. Secondly, what I'd do is I'd change the tax structure. I'd build more money into the idea of long-term planning, the idea about incentives for new ideas. A lot of scientists have ideas, but it's the question about we're building in Kazakhstan, we're building proof of concept centers where they start to understand what to do, because a lot of the scientists are great theoretically, but the idea of making a practical product doesn't work. But if they had, and the idea is that some of the business people were not exactly great in science. So the question is, you needed a merger of these two factors together. So, but with tax policy, you can basically, do that. Third is the idea, I changed the nature. Interesting story in the Star Tribune 2 days ago, talking about the idea that Minnesota was last in the United States in the number of students studying IT, which scares the dickens out of me too, because quite frankly, you can't draw people here. But we were doing, we needed 6,000, or no, we were doing 6,000 a year possibly, but we really needed 30,000. And the question was, all these new businesses were growing in Texas or Phoenix or someplace else. We're not going to be able to compete in the future. So I'd expand the idea of new technologies. The idea, what we've done is we've cut off half our population because we don't invest enough in STEM for young girls going into science and technology. Quite frankly, we've made it a male-dominated industry, but half of your brains are cut out because women who come up, I mean, the original person who did the science study, was a woman. She understood it and the men didn't. And so what I do is I change the investment in STEM going from grade schools up, because you have a short-term policy, which is the idea about how do you get people to move to Minnesota and work here and stay here. Secondly is the idea that there's a group working on the idea of Minnesota redefining itself as the medical center of the world. Another group which is working on, quite a few water businesses are here. We could become the center of research on water for the entire world. Nobody's taking the leadership on this. So we have the potential, but unless we do it, other places will take our place. And so what I do is I'd start to provide incentives, the idea of foundation grants, because often there's a discussion going on now about a major conference that would be expanded. The University of Minnesota thought they would participate, but if it was the idea of using money, anything from the university, they didn't want to do that. And what you've got to do is you've got to have a longer term thinking process, that starts to show that this is going to cost money. And it's going to take the idea of a system-wide development, which is your longer term answer, because if your kids don't grow up, when I was on the Met Council, we gave money out to arts groups, but you don't get somebody getting to the age of 17 and deciding they really love classical music. So we paid for as many school kids as possible in elementary school to hear the Minnesota Orchestra, because you grow your own audiences, whether it's in education or arts and culture or anything else, you build it. And we have to do that, but that's a long-term concept because it ties into the fact that we don't have enough of a supply here in Minnesota because of our policies in the past that are now kicking us in the tail. And so it's this idea. So until somebody politically starts to understand this and invest the money in it to basically kick off the process and to start focusing on our potentials, we're not going to be able to do it. And then we'll wake up and we'll say, why did Denver pass us? And why did Minnesota used to be the place where people came from all over the country to study the Met Council and all these other groupings in terms of governance, or the idea of Cedar Riverside, or the idea of Jonathan, or the group I was on, the Minnesota Experimental City, where we were going to build the model technological city of the future. And the only thing that resulted from that was this group came in when we were put out of business by the legislature, and a small group from California called Disney that built Epcot Center based upon our plans. So we did have an impact, but it wasn't in Minnesota. And we had the top minds from the whole country and the world basically designing stuff. And Minnesota would have been the center for that. And we still had the potential, but we lost it. So I would do the investment, taxation, thinking, political, and those processes, which are at the base of the idea of longer term changes.
Okay. And I don't know if you can answer this quickly. We had one last thing. How would you invest in rural Minnesota, which often gets overlooked?
Well, number one, I would sit there and the tax policies, you can change the tax policies for incentives. Secondly is the idea of the educational systems, whether by technology or by the investments in certain programs that you do. I spend more time than I wish at the Mayo Clinic. And I think about two doctors wandering through southern Minnesota that decide to choose a small town named Rochester. And right now, 30,000 out of 100 and some thousand people are tied to the Mayo Clinic. And so all of these things, whether it's the idea, northern Minnesota or Alexandria becoming the center of a water production area is not unforeseen or impossible. The idea of mining, we've got the 8th district, which is the combination of mining, tourism, the idea of metals, the idea of education that can be discussed, that can be distributed electronically or technologically. It has every element. The 8th district could become the model for the world on how to renew an area. And I wrote a paper on that once, and unfortunately, my dear friend Rick Nolan decided to leave Congress at that point, and the new person there, I don't think has any interest in things like that. So we have the potential. And you can do it by policy and by the promotion of educational programs and the support. I sat through a meeting where a guy in Fergus Falls needed one person who was a specialist in computer technology. He had 24 people, and he was thinking about moving to the Twin Cities because his company, the Twin Cities, because he couldn't get the person that would move to Fergus Falls. So it's the support of everything from arts to the idea of education. You can tell, look at the number during basketball tournaments, look at the number of hyphenated school districts that you've seen playing in the different zones or the different levels of business, where you'll see something that has 3 or 4 school districts put together. In most small towns, the school is the largest employer. When the school goes out of business and merges with something else, it is usually the precursor of the death of the town. And so the question is, you need to keep that on a distributed basis. I told people, I said, listen, you shift to a policy where you have distributed, if every home had solar panels and you did a tax policy that did that, what does that do to centralized heating or centralized, electricity? You totally change the nature of power within energy and distribution systems. And with wind and solar, you can do that because parts of Minnesota are are one of the greatest centers for wind power in the United States.
Mhm.
We can do it. But we don't have a centralized focus right now because we lost state planning and some other agencies. And so the potential is there. That's what I do to save rural Minnesota, because we all are part of one, and we say it politically, but we don't really mean it. And so the question is starting putting our money and our politics where our mouth is. And we can do it because we are all, most of the people in the Twin Cities, a lot of the people wanted to stay up in small towns, but they didn't have jobs.
Mhm.
So they came here.
Okay. Well, thank you, Todd, for an informative presentation, and thanks to Grayson Simmons, who has been providing behind-the-scenes help today. Our next Great Decision session is on Friday, May 10th, with Chrissy Siver, who will speak on science across borders. And a note for OLLI members, the course request period is open now through May 6th. And for those of you who are not yet OLLI members but want to see what OLLI is all about, they're offering a summer-only membership for only $49. So you could visit the OLLI website at olli.umn.edu to check that out. But otherwise, thanks everyone for a great session, and we will see you May 10th.
Thank you.